like way over there. I'm gonna like, really. Hey.
Hello.
So I'm Ron Miller. I cover the enterprise for TechCrunch, and we're going to talk about drones. Over the last decade, we've watched as drones have entered the public's imagination, and the industry has just begun to develop, first for hobbyists, and then as a commercial undertaking aimed squarely at business. Perhaps unrealistic usage scenarios have led to a hype cycle, and today questions remain about how the industry will scale and flourish, and we're going to talk to these folks about what it will take for the industry to really take off, if you'll pardon the expression. I'm going to let each of you introduce yourselves, and then we'll get back into the questions, okay? I'm going to start, Chris.
Yeah, I'm Chris Anderson, CEO of 3DR, which does drone data, and I'm also the founder and chairman of the Drone Code project, which is the sort of Android, open source Android equivalent for drones.
My name's Adam Bree. I'm the CEO of Skydio, and we make fully autonomous drones. And we started the company because we think autonomy, the ability to trust the drone to fly itself in a useful way, is likely to be one of the foundational things that makes all of the exciting concepts in drones possible.
I'm Laura Major, the CTO of Sci-Fi Works. We are the leading tethered drone company, which means we have a small cable that connects to our drone and allows it to fly for hours and even days at a time.
And I'm Arnaud Thiercelin, the head of US R&D at DJI, and also head of global developer technologies for DJI, and all enterprise projects that are specific to the US.
All right, thank you. So let's start off by looking at the state of the industry today. We saw a lot of hype. The initial hype cycle seems to have passed. So where are we in terms of the drone industry?
I probably have the longest tenure here because I started 10 years ago when I was the editor of Wired. I started a community site called DIY Drones, which was a novel concept, the notion that regular people could have drones, and kind of the notion that smartphone components could transform the industry. I think that, I don't think that the hype has necessarily died down. DJI has been tremendously successful, one of the most successful companies in China. As a result, I think what you're seeing is that a classic explosion, kind of Cambrian explosion of different companies and startups all trying to do the space, a little bit like the beginnings of the PC industry. And then it more quickly than anybody expected, concentrated around a global giant in the form of DJI, and then everybody had to kind of go from the drones to the data side, which takes longer to develop.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, I think when drones came onto the scene 4 or 5 years ago, it pretty quickly kindled a lot of excitement about amazing concepts, both on the consumer side and in the enterprise. And I think you're right that a big part of the story over the last 4 or 5 years has been this gap between the concepts and what you can do with existing products. Which is primarily like if you have a skilled pilot that's flying it, you can do a lot, but the barrier to entry is pretty high, both for consumers and for businesses. Like businesses, you really want something scalable where you can just push a button and get the data. And so we're pretty optimistic that the technology has gotten to the point where over the next 5 years, we're going to see that gap close quite a bit. And one of the announcements we had this morning, we announced the Skydio Autonomy Platform, which is an SDK on top of R1, which basically makes it possible for developers to leverage like the full power of the autonomy system that we've developed. And with just a few lines of Python, you can create custom skills, you can create your own applications. And we think something like that is going to be really one of the keys to making all of the different drone concepts come to life.
Did you guys want to add anything? Or?
Yeah, sure. So about 12 years ago, the drone industry was all about parts that you would put together in a DIY set. And I mean, Chris sure can relate about this. And about 5, 6 years ago, we saw a first revolution in the drone industry where these parts ended up coming up together to create final products you could just buy off the shelf and start working with it directly. And I think right now we're at the verge of another revolution. And I mean, on our side, we've been working on this for quite a few years at this point, and which is very much going to focus on enterprise. I mean, of course, we're not leaving the consumer users behind. But in the same point that Adam was saying, we've been building developer technologies for years now to offer all the tools for people to take these drones that we build and start creating all sorts of applications, data pipeline in the way that Chris was talking about in a second. And this is very much because Today, when you go and talk to an enterprise customer, they're no longer asking you what's a drone, what's a flight controller, how does it work, how does it fly. They tell you, I have this problem, this employee of mine has been bringing their own personal drones and we saw how he can actually fix it. Tell me how I can deploy 5,000 of these tomorrow. This is really where we are right now, and all of this is happening because of all these building blocks that happened in the past. And the one we have today are definitely setting up for a bright future.
So I know that Wired reported that last year the U.S. Army stopped using DJI drones. I know that you fixed that problem since then, but I want to bring it up as security, because if you are launching a bunch of drones, you want to absolutely be sure that they're secure. You don't want the possibility of anybody being able to remotely take them over and do something nefarious with them. So how do you assure your customers and the public at large that that's not going to happen, that these things are secure and not able to be taken over in that way? You go ahead.
So I think that's really one advantage of our platform for customers who are worried about security. Over our tether, we do all the command and control of the drone and also receive all the data from the drone. And so that offers a differentiator in terms of securing that there can't be any interference from the outside.
So, I have to pick this up.
Right, of course.
So first, I'm going to be very clear. This memo from the Army was completely unfounded on any facts whatsoever. But it did open up our eyes on something that we needed to do more, which is communicating and very much showing how transparent we are willing to do. And after that, you say fixed it, but the one thing that we fixed is, of course, we have this ongoing bug fixing that we do every time a security is being detected, which didn't start with the memo and is not stopping with the memo. But what we did is we hired a private company to investigate all of our source code and put an actual report on clearly establishing and explaining what's happening and what's possible or not on the user side. And the bottom line was that we give 100% of the control to user to have their data. Now, on the pure security aspect of things, our remote connection was always encrypted, always has been. But security is never an ending game. It's cat and mouse game. So you always kind of have to chase and fix things. And what's important is the response time. What came out of that report as well is DJI has an average of 48 hours to do bug fixing on anything that is security related. And this is really powerful.
Yes.
I think there's a few different concerns in play with drones, I think, that fall in a few different buckets. I think one of the big ones for adoption is being able to trust the drone to do the right thing. And I think that people's mental model of what drones are today is pretty heavily shaped by this notion of a hobbyist who may or may not know what they're doing, flying it, maybe not following regulations. And I think one of the really interesting things as these devices become more software-defined and software-driven is that the rules can actually become part of that software. And so our belief is that as autonomy becomes more prevalent in the market, the model will shift, and people will start to just trust these devices more because they'll behave in a more reliable way. And you can actually start to enforce the regulation. Whatever we decide the rules are, you can just guarantee that the drone is going to follow them.
It's worth noting, and Arnaud's too polite to say so, but this was, he's absolutely right that the concerns were, I think, factually unfounded, and I don't think actually DJI did anything wrong. This is political. DJI is an extremely successful high-tech Chinese company, and we're in a climate in the midst of trade wars and tariffs and crazy tweets coming out of the White House, where just being a successful Chinese company is almost enough to spur paranoia.
Absolutely.
I wish it weren't the case, but that's the political climate we live in.
But even given that, and I will give you that, you have to admit that if the public has any concern at all that a drone could be somehow remotely controlled because it is communicating with the ground, over the internet, then how do you have to assure people that that's not a problem.
That actually was not the concern. The concern was about the data coming off the drone being sent elsewhere.
Yeah. Okay. Speaking of data, let's talk about data. Regardless of your use case, you guys are all about collecting a lot of data, whether it's photographing something, looking down at a mine, security, following an athlete and seeing what they're doing, whatever the scenario is doing. You have to collect the data. And I told this story on the phone, and I think it's worth telling again that I think this was 2014 or 2015. I had a conversation with Aaron Levy from Box, and he said he wanted to get involved with drone manufacturers. I'm like, Aaron, what do you want to get involved with drones for? And he said, because they use a lot of data, and we store data. So when you think about all of that data that you're collecting, how do you get that data off of the drone, and how do you integrate it into enterprise systems so it's not this silo of data that's just sitting, somewhere on a hard drive or?
Yeah. That's exactly what we do. It's actually, it's not that hard for a couple of reasons. One is that the regulations right now require drones to be used within visual line of sight. So they're actually quite close to the ground station. And often they're used, we use them in construction, for example, and they often, have, they're in urban areas, so they might have connectivity. So today, sometimes it's a matter of taking an SD card out and sticking it in a laptop. Sometimes it's done over Wi-Fi. Sometimes it's done over LTE. Because the processing the data it takes maybe an hour or so, it doesn't have to be instantaneous. Now, obviously, it'd be better if it took less than that long. And so there's this the push towards what's called edge computing, which is being able to do what's called photogrammetry, but basically, computer vision and reconstruction, 3D models, kind of on site, either in the drone itself, which is essentially what Skydio does to some degree, or on the ground, proximate over Wi-Fi. We do that right now with an iPad. And the bounty from Apple's GPU and AR investment means that it's essentially become an edge computing device, and we don't have to go to the cloud until later. So all that kind of real-time stuff can be actually done on the mobile layer.
Yeah. So absolutely, I concur with Chris. This is something that can definitely be done on the mobile side, and on our end, our goal is always to create the best platform for people to build application on top. One of the components is to create the best pipeline of data that we can create between the aircraft and the remote controller. And this is bringing the biggest amount of data. And recently with the Mavic 2, we just introduced 1080p live video feed. And this is continuous work on increasing the bandwidth. But there is a problem that actually exists. The data set that you can get from a drone is not only video. It can be all sorts of sensitive data. And you get in a paradigm where it's very possible to have too much data to even send it, regardless of the kind of pipeline that you have down. And I'm thinking even 5G in its best spec. And so you're confronted into a situation where you need to bring the edge compute even closer to the hardware, so you can actually process that data and at least have a part of the answer that you were looking for originally, because that's just the only way of handling that much data. And then you can send that answer back into your mobile, and then you can distribute the processing that you want to do and putting it exactly where you want it to do.
So when I look at any kind of newish technology, I know you guys have been around for a long time, but it's new, I think, to most people in the scheme of things. Standards have a way of advancing a technology, right? And I know you're working on that a little bit. And they provide a base of common services. And if you have that base of agreed upon services, I think it advances any industry where that happens. And it's interesting that I was talking to the digital ledger technology people earlier, and they said you have to be careful that you don't do those standards too soon, or you can actually suppress the innovation that's going on there. So where are standards at in this industry, and is that conversation going on right now?
It's very similar to to mobile. So Apple has their own standard. They're a vertically integrated one. They have their own app store, their own SDK, et cetera. And I think GGI is very similar to that, very kind of Apple-like model. And then Android is a more open model, and that's what we do with drone code. The standards right now largely consist with sort of common communication standards. There's one called Mavlink. Then there's compliance with the FAA regulations, and that's something we're all working on together. And then the lower level is just regular computing stuff. How NVIDIA and GPUs talk to flight controllers and that kind of stuff. So I think you're going to see it play out very much like mobile, and we're about like the equivalent to maybe 2010, where Android and iOS were then. That's where we are now.
So to extend on that point, there's a couple more standards that are actually going on that I want to be pointing out. So the first and most important is remote ID. which is a very big topic because there's a lot of different things that happens on the drone industry, a lot of different scenarios that people are like being concerned about how they can be used. And the first answer that everybody's looking for in terms of government agencies, in terms of law enforcement, is identifying what's flying and when it's flying. And so this is a remote idea. This is an ongoing conversation of defining that standard across the industry. And we're very much trying to make sure that this is for the best of the drone industry. But we are, in a way, so big that it helps and it doesn't help at the same time. But this is a conversation that needs to happen with every actor in the industry at the same time. A couple more worth noting. One is around parachute systems on top of drones. The FAA is making one of the requirements to do BVLOS that you have the capacity when you fly above people to have a safety mechanism in case you have a critical failure of your platform. And this is a parachute system. And this comes in many colors, what size of parachutes, what kind of deployment speed, etc. So this is another kind of standard that is happening. And the last one I want to point out is around defining what autonomy of a drone is. And this is really, really new. So there are groups who are getting together and trying to define what exactly that looks like. Because that's definitely the next step for drones. Because like I said, in terms of mass adoptions, when you start having a situation where you want to deploy 5,000 drones at once, you can't exactly rent a stadium to train them 5,000 people to be 107 pilots. So we are going to go towards this, but just like any standard conversation, they're lengthy. They require everybody to agree, to get together and have the definitions. And the FAA and other regulators are always having the perfect approach. They bring everybody back down in terms of the excitement you have in tech and bring you into the reality of what it is, because these things are flying next to people, next to everything. So you do need to have an extra level of rigor when you design anything.
So yours are tethered, so I was wondering how that would impact you.
Yeah, another angle that we're looking at is the beyond line of sight control of drones. So what that means is having the operators be separated, whether that's miles or away from the actual drone operations, because drones allow you to perform a task that you don't want a person to perform. Go into an area, a hazardous area, watch in an area where people aren't going to be there for security purposes. So being able to separate the drone operator physically from the drone itself is really important. And so there's a lot of work to be done in the regulatory environment to enable that as well, so that you can have a single operator and one command center controlling hundreds or even thousands of drones across the country or across the globe.
Just to add on that point, all the economic efficiencies of automation come when you kind of increase the ratio of people to machines. Because right now, because of FAA regs, it's one pilot, one
right.
drone. So we basically haven't saved anything in terms of human cost. Once we can go to one to many, then we start to see the economic efficiencies.
So our viewpoint is actually a little bit different here. I think we're really still in the first inning of drones as a category. I would say, in terms of phones, we're maybe closer to like the brick phone that is owned by maybe like a few people around the world. And our view is that the usage models that are really going to scale, that are going to reach tens of millions of consumers and benefit tens of millions of businesses around the world, are going to be pretty different from what we're seeing today. And so, I think that there are still a lot of sort of fundamental innovation left to get to the kinds of products that are going to realize the visions that are out there. So I think standards are probably part of that, but I think the technology itself needs to progress quite a bit to get to the point where it's really useful for tens, hundreds, and maybe someday a billion people. I think that's possible, but we're still very, very early days.
Yeah. You mentioned regulation, and I wanted to ask about that and the role that regulation is going to play here, because I'm curious, do you guys think that regulation is propelling the industry or holding it back, or a little of both, or where are we with that?
I honestly think that so far regulation has been helping the industry. For the longest time, if you wanted to have any commercial applications of drones, you need to have a 333 exemption. And the Part 107 has been defining the ground to actually conduct these operations. So I don't think that the regulatory body is actually here to block anything. They're coming up with reasonable request for the severity of the risk that you may be taking with these operations. But of course, when you're a little bit frustrated when some of the conversations are being a little bit lengthy, but when you hear their actual case and concerns that they have, you quickly realize how they're absolutely necessary to be taken care of.
Yeah, I agree. I think that regulation has been a little bit of a scapegoat for the industry, but the trend line is very positive. So before starting Skydio, I was working on Project Wing at Google X, starting in 2012, and the fear there was that the FAA was just going to totally shut the whole thing down. There were going to be no commercial drones. And step by step, there have been reasonable paths that I think are reflective of the state of products. And I think as the products get better, the regulations get more permissive, and we're pretty optimistic that that's going to continue.
I think that it's worth noting that although I agree totally that the regulators have been remarkably flexible and forward-thinking, we pushed them to move faster by using exemptions for consumer use and getting millions of drones out in the air. So if it weren't for DJI and 3DR in the early days, using these so-called recreational flight exemptions, right, which were not regulated, there wouldn't be so many people out there thinking about the commercial applications and making the commercial requests. So by the time the FAA realized that drones were a thing, we already had so many of them out there that they couldn't shut them. They couldn't put the genie back in the bottle.
Right, and I think about it, if you think about it, the government has a role in regulating things that are flying in the air to some extent. There has to be some guardrails, right? Mm-hmm. There has to be some control, because you don't want just chaos, right? Yeah. And especially if it scales the way that you guys are talking about it scaling, there has to be some sort of sensible regulation involved. You just don't want it stifling innovation.
Totally.
So I have a question for you. I was watching my colleague Danny Crichton talk to the space people this morning, and they were talking about putting these low-cost, satellites. They're very small now, they fit in your hand small, and they go up into the atmosphere and they collect data. And it occurred to me that they collect some of the very same data that you guys are collecting with drones, and they're getting cheaper. You have SpaceX, you have all these space companies delivering them. So as they become cheaper and they become easier to deploy, is that some sort of existential threat to your industry, or do you see them living side by side?
We think about this a lot. We work very closely with a big company called Esri, which is kind of a geospatial company that started with the dawn of satellites. And we also, in our investment circles, we have satellite companies as well. So two things to understand. One is that just the resolution of our imagery is 2 orders of magnitude better. So we do sort of centimeter level, and they do kind of meter level. The second is that 2/3 of the planet is covered by clouds at any given point in time, and we fly under the clouds. So just from the kind of temporal resolution of being able to go anywhere, anytime, get that imagery, and the spatial resolution, getting centimeter rather than meter, there's always going to be a natural division of labor between those two.
Yep.
I think implicit in that question is a notion of sort of what drones are capable of today or have been capable of. Like some of the use cases that are working best right now in the commercial space are these ones where the drone sort of acts like a low-flying satellite. Like it flies above all the obstacles, it uses GPS, it looks down, it just takes downward-facing imagery. But there are so many other things you can do if you can actually trust it to fly close to the ground, fly through structures, fly inside construction sites. Mm-hmm. The dream really is it's just this image sensor that's moving around unconstrained in 3D, can be anywhere at any time. And certainly I think with that vision fully realized, there's a completely sort of orthogonal value proposition to just this downward-facing satellite mission.
So one last question, because we got almost just a little over a minute left. If there are people who wanted to do a drone startup at this point, and I know you're the closest to having just been started up, and you're the most mature as a company, what gaps do you think still exist that people could exploit in this industry?
So I would recommend using the Skydio Autonomy Platform to go off. There's some really cool stuff that I think can be built. Like our system understands the 3D structure of the world around it. It knows where people are. It knows where different kinds of objects are. And internally, we've seen a lot of this come to life over really like the last few months, where with a day of dedicated effort, you can build an amazing application for like filming a soccer game or mapping a structure. And there's just a lot of things like that. Like you look in any direction, and with a little bit of creativity and a little bit of code building on top of the autonomy system, you can do some amazing stuff. My hope is that we're now at the point where all these crazy dreams can actually become reality. And I think there really are some very exciting applications and businesses to be built there.
I would say I love their system, and I'm super impressed by it, but I'm required to say that I think they should use the drone code system, which does all that stuff. Well, not quite, because their Skydio is really amazing. But a lot of that stuff, it's also open source and it's free. But more to the point, I would recommend they not start a drone startup. Instead, they focus on data. There are so many verticals out there that require expertise in construction or mining or agriculture or whatever. We're nerds. We know about drones. The drone kind of part is maybe not entirely solved, but there's a lot of good solutions out there. How to make these useful, how to actually solve real-world problems requires expertise in real-world problems, and it's not going to happen with the people here on this stage.
All right, we got to end it right there. Thank you so much. Let's give these people a round of applause.